I've always been aware that Witney has a long history of blanket making. Growing up, this didn't really mean much to me, other than that there were some old buildings that my dad pointed out here and there. The significance of Witney's past suddenly became more real when I came upon the rare Pathe film that was made in the 1920s. I was drawn in by the industry and machinery and busyness with which people moved around this film. Witney appeared to show an urgency of being a place of importance, something I never appreciated before. Although this film captured my imagination, it still felt a little bit distant to me. It needed bringing to life. I'm really lucky that in my family there is someone who could do this. My grandfather, David Smith, is the last in a long line of Smiths that ran some of the blanket mills. I wanted to know the human side to the blanket making story, so I asked him. David provided a now rare first-hand account of what it was like working in those blanket mills, and brought to life the significance and importance of over 600 years of Witney's blanket making history. If I asked you, David, what were you looking for in a good sheep to make blankets?
I think we'd look for medium quality of fibre, what we would call about 50s or 56s quality. Length about 3.5 to 4 inches, and that would be about it.
What type of sheep? Was there a particular type you were looking for?
No particular type. We bought a tremendous amount of wool from New Zealand, which was a byproduct of the frozen meat trade. It's where the wool was removed from the skins of slaughtered sheep chemically by a depilatory, which partly cleansed the wool. This was known as slipe wool, and we used tons and tons of it.
Was it cheaper?
All the wools had their different prices, and I think when I was in full flight as a wool buyer, I would know the approximate value of about 25 or 30 grades of wool day by day.
What was a good price for wool?
The good price for wool was what the market was saying at the time. And the great art was to try and look ahead for what the prices would be in the future and buy accordingly. So you bought according to your needs, but you also bought according to what you felt the market was going to do. And our machinery was all set up so that it would take a great variety of different kinds of wool, so you could be buying the best value and still make the best blanket.
What was the first process when wool enters the powerhouse?
The wool arrived in great big bales of either compressed into big bales, and some of them were actually done up with iron straps, very highly compressed. So the wool arrived in large lumps, and the whole thing was to disperse the various bales of wool amongst each other, break down all the lumps, and gradually process the wool until it became a uniform film in the carding machines, which would mean that you had a nice regular thread at the end of it.
So if I asked you, what does opening up the wool mean?
It means putting it into a machine with a huge revolving drum with great big teeth on it, which ripped the fleeces apart and spat them out the other side.
Yeah.
Most of our blankets were a very good standard grade. We made a finer one out of merino wool, which are very, very fine and soft. But most of the blankets we made in those days were all medium quality wool. We had a very large wool store where we maintained a big stock of wool, because when wool prices were low, it was good to buy the stock and keep it. So there was a lot of heavy work moving the bales about, and also conveying the opened wool from machine to machine.
Was it quite hot and stuffy in those?
Not really, no.
Okay.
Perishing cold in the winter. And sometimes in the summer I'd send across to the tobacconists for ice creams.
Oh, did the workers have ice cream sometime? Did you ever
Well,
stop?
no, I gave them.
Oh. Can you explain carding?
Well, carding is a process that disentangles the lumps of wool. Some of the lumps can be quite tight, and the machine consisted of spiked rollers, one very large one, about 4 feet in diameter, and pairs of smaller ones round the outside, all covered with thousands and thousands of steel pins. And the spaces between the rollers got progressively smaller, so the lumps were reduced gradually in size as they progressed through the machine. You get the big wide bobbins taken off the carding machine, and all they do is to be on the mule so that you can fill up the weaver's bobbin that's being created.
Okay. And just because I think some people might not know, what is a bobbin?
What, the weaver's bobbin? Mm-hmm. It was a compressed paper tube that the yarn was wound onto. It was very simple to put the weaver's bobbin onto the mule spindle and spin all the yarn onto the bobbin, and that would be taken direct from the mule to the weaving shed, and the girls there would simply take it and put it into the shuttle. There was no extra cost of rewinding the yarn that was going to be woven.
Okay.
Can you explain why it's called a mule?
Well, it was a combination of two things. First of all, there was a very clever chap in the late 18th century called Arkwright, who produced a little machine driven by a water power, which had about 8 or 10 little spindles producing yarn. There was another one known as the spinning jenny, which went to and fro like the mule, but again it was hand wound, and there was a chap called Crompton put them together to form the combination. It was called a mule because it was a union of two other things.
I see. And it is beautiful because the machinery and the mechanics of it they work like clockwork.
Yes, it's a very interesting and very complicated machine.
Were you as blanket makers quite proud of it?
Well, they were very, very widespread in the cotton and woolen trade.
And can you explain what the warp and the weft is?
Well, the warp is a finer, more tightly spun yarn, which gives this strength to resist the battering about if it gets in the loom. The weft is more softly spoken with less twist in it, because you wanted to get a lot of material between the warp to create a fairly firm cloth.
So when the blanket, at what stage did the blanket go to crawling?
After it had been woven.
And what would happen at crawling to it?
At Crawley, it would be first of all milled, because you can't get a dense enough fabric simply by banging fibres together in a loom. It just doesn't work. But the milling is the process whereby all the wool fibres creep together, because the wool has two extremely interesting properties. One of it is elasticity, like an elastic band, and the other one is the scales on any animal fibre which only point one way. It's like putting an horn of barley up your sleeve. As soon as you start moving, it will only move one way. And if you get a piece of hair out of your head and rub it between your fingers, you'll find that it will move in the direction of the root. So manipulating a soapy cloth in a big milling machine gradually shrunk the fibres, shrunk the cloth, made the cloth denser, which is what you wanted in a good heavy blanket.
So if you had to sum up what milling is, what is the process of milling?
Milling is shrinking and consolidating the fabric. After that, it would be thoroughly washed in a big machine to get out all the dirt and oil that was added previously. Because at milling, you have to have the thing damp and soapy as well if you can. And so the scouring would remove all the dirt and that would dissolve in soap. Before we got a big machine for drying the cloth, you had these tenterfields and these great big frames with spikes on them, upon which you stretched the blanket cloth to its exact size and let it dry in the open air.
Hence the term tenter hooks.
It's not tender hooks, it's tenter hooks.
So if you were on tenter hooks,
you got your fingers scratched.
So the blanket would dry, and then what would happen to it afterwards?
Well, after that, the fluffy surface is raised on it, which is another machine, a bit like the carding machine, which is rollers covered in spikes, which actually pluck the fibres out of the main body of the blanket and gradually create this fluffy surface. Our aim was to have such a nap, a fluffy cover on it, so that you were unable to see the underlying weave.
What can you tell us the term showing its teeth?
Well, that's really what I was doing. We used to talk about a cloth showing its teeth if you could actually see through the fluff to the weave underneath.
What was the next process when it was fluffed?
Cut it up into units and whip the ends.
What were the size units that were standard?
60 by 80 inches, 70 by 90, and 90 by 100 in those days.
And those were the three sizes of blankets?
Just about, yes.
Yeah. And why did you cut them in those sizes?
Just to suit the different types of bed that people were in.
So they were mostly used for bedding?
Well, all of them were used for bedding, yes.
How much did your dad teach you? Was he a good teacher?
He taught me wool buying. That was it's quite essential to have that capacity in a person in real authority, because a lot of abuse could be made of it. Because what used to happen is that there were wool merchants, mostly situated in Yorkshire, and they would come with a suitcase full of samples, and we'd have them all out in my wool buying office, and I'd look at these various lots, and then we'd wrap them up again. And I said, "Well, I'll buy that one." And he said, "I'll buy that one." And I said, "And I'll bid a few pence a pound less for that one." And there were a lot of firms doing this, and the thing was to keep the stocks of the various grades of wool that you were using, keep them up, and also keep an idea of the variations in the market.
It sounds like you really enjoyed that part of it.
I did very much, yes.
Were you the best wool buyer?
I was a very good wool buyer, and I remember one chap says, he said, "Mr. Smith," he said, he was in my wool buying office, "Mr. Smith," he said, "I'll tell you one thing, when I come in here, I feel safe."
Oh.
Well, it goes back a long time. If you you see, William was brought up by his grandfather, so that makes 6 generations.
Yeah.
And also, the blanket hall, which was built in 1720 or something like that. There were at least 4 smiths amongst those who agreed to have it built.
Gosh.
And I'm quite sure that there could be a connection. If we could get the genealogy worked out, we could probably work our way back to being connected with the building of the blanket hall. I just can't realise that I'm the last of the blankets making smiths. You see, there's not many people of my that I remember. I remember few years ago, you'd meet some old weavers or something in the town, and I remember meeting one old girl in the street somewhere. She said, Them's was good days, good bosses,